I'm Owen Flanagan, and I'm a philosopher also from Duke, and I've been trying to change Alex's mad dog mind for a long time, so good luck on that. But Dan and I will try. So I actually been interested, I guess I could start with what Alex said, is I've always been interested in this question about, Sellers has this quote that a lot of us naturalists in philosophy use, where he says that philosophy is the attempt to think about how things hang together in, how things conceived of in the broadest possible sense hang together in the broadest possible sense. And as some other people have said, I mean, it would be nice to have a unified theory about how things work. And it does seem that as a cultural project, one of the problems is somehow meshing, if we can, our scientific understanding of things with what is best preserved from common sense. So I'm interested, I've always been interested in that project. Autobiographically, maybe it's relevant to say, I grew up as a good little Catholic boy, interested in questions like why is there what there is, and what about reward and punishment, and what about freedom, and what about what happens after life. And in the same section of the world where Rebecca was growing up as a nice Jewish girl, probably asking the same questions but in a different context. And so by the time I was in college, I was interested in what I came to see as primarily scientific questions about how did life emerge, how did sentient life emerge, so I did increasingly go to the sciences. By the time I finished college, my teachers, half of them thought that I should go on in philosophy, and half of them thought I should go on in experimental psychology. I realized if I had gone on in experimental psychology, I wanted to do brain science, but there really wasn't in 1970 brain science. It was still something before that. So I did the next best thing, and I've been attached to the naturalistic program since then. I studied with Willard Van Orman Quine and some of his students, and my conception of naturalism has been this idea that the best philosophy is continuous with the best science, perhaps at a more general level. The specific problems I've been interested in are the problem of consciousness. And my attitude about consciousness is that by the mid-1990s, when after people like Dan and myself and a few other people, philosophers had their say about saying consciousness could be made safe for science, that our work as philosophers was pretty much done, and then it's just empirical questions of working out the scientific details. And I'm disturbed by the way philosophers continue to go on and moan and groan about the hard problem and the impossibility and conceivability of thought experiments and what if they're, and it's disturbing to me about my own field. The other area besides consciousness I've been interested in, and this was again work I did in the early 90s, was on ethics, and always been interested in this question of whether or not, so I wrote a book, around the same time I wrote a book on consciousness on what I called varieties of moral personality, ethics and psychological realism. And the idea was that ethics could be naturalized. There was just no problem. There was no reason to think that we had to think of morality either in supernaturalistic terms or in morally realistic terms, or as, my general view is is roughly that morality is just another social institution, and due to the certain bad effects of theological traditions, we've come to think of it as something which requires a separate sort of explanation. I continue to work on that. I think that I'm always very curious about the way that everybody gets the heebie-jeebies about what they allege to be Hume's problem, the problem of normativity, the problem of how you derive is from ought. The answer is you don't derive is from ought, because that would be a fallacy, but you can make inferences the best explanation about what you ought to do, or what is reasonable to do, or what will make life go best, or what enhances well-being, and there are often competing goods about this. These two interests in naturalizing mind and naturalizing morality have led me in some recent work, and this is back to the little boy that I once was, to what I call the really hard problems. And I think these are really hard problems for naturalists, what I call mind, morals, and the meaning of life. And by that I just mean making, this is partly a cultural project of taking seriously the fact that most of our compatriots on Earth are not, or at least in America, we'll start with just America, have trouble seeing how life could make sense or be meaningful if the world is as most of the people around the table think. And I try in some of my most recent work to give a kind of an upbeat explanation of how it's possible to find meaning in a fully material world. One other interest I have, and then I'll close with what I could change my mind about, is I'm actually very interested in the way other traditions conceive of the world, the natural world, the place of science in it, and whether they have the same problems as us. So for example, I've been working for a long time recently, for a long time sort of secretly and then lately more publicly in classical Chinese and classical Indian philosophy. And I'll be interested in the discussions of free will here because I am one of those people who think that it's a black hole in philosophy and that other cultures happily avoid discussing it. It just doesn't come up. And I'm thinking here of Hindu and Buddhist traditions, classical Chinese philosophy. It just doesn't come up. And some people are trying to say, here's what Buddhists would think if they talked about free will. And I'm saying, shut up, don't even talk about it. They're better off for not even bringing it up. So I have some things to say about that. And finally, what I would change my mind about. So there's a literature in psychology that maybe people in this room know about. I know Dan certainly knows about it, and I'm sure Rebecca does too. It's a literature on what's called positive illusions. And the positive illusion literature basically says something like this, that the findings are things like this, that you give a public health lecture at the beginning of the Stanford undergraduates arrive, and you say, you women in the room, the chances of getting breast cancer in your life are 1 in 8. So here are some things you can do for breast health. And men, it's 1 in 8 for prostate cancer, and here's some things you should do for prostate. And then you ask the students afterwards, what is the probability of you having the bad thing happen to you? And always in the population, they get back much lower rates of believing that this thing will happen to them than they should get back. Obviously, some people will know they're at greater or lesser risk, but in a population, you should get back the base rate, which you just reported to these smart people. And the findings are that you never get back the base rate. You get back lower, and then when they pull out the subgroups, this is the allegation, that when you pull out these different groups, the only group that are what they call realists about things are people who are moderately depressed. The people who are very depressed, of course, think they already have the disease that you just mentioned. But I think this is interesting. Now, Dan has given an explanation of trying to argue that these kind of positive illusions are adaptive. I think that's preposterous, but it's really a hope I have more than anything else. I'd like to think that maybe these things are hopes instead of beliefs, in which case they'd be less rational. It's kind of like, I'm not answering the question, do I believe that I won't get that? I'm saying, I hope I don't get that. So, but I've been working on this for a long time, and I can't get out of the way. And the reason they're relevant to a group like this, and this is what I could change my mind about. Stephen Weinberg, many years ago, when I read one of his wonderful articles, I think Stephen said something like, it's obvious that religion has done more harm than good. And that's the view I tend to have. And I tend to have the view that believing false things does always more harm than good. But I worry about my belief there. I worry about that belief. So I guess the thing to say is what I could change my mind about, I get stuck in that middle easily. Some days I think false beliefs are always the enemy. And then when I speak in front of psychologists, they say, you philosophers are weird. And maybe you scientists are weird too. You care about the truth. Most people don't care about the truth, and it's actually even bad for them. So I think that this is a topic where I could go either way on, and I'd love to sit here and get your wisdom on. So, do
you know what the students would say if they were asked, why do you think you'll have a 2% chance even though we told you it's 1 in 8?
There's a lot of, I've read a lot of this literature over time. Maybe Dan can speak to that. I don't know what they say. But people tell me it really, that my explanation, which tries to give the They hope it. It's a misattribution. They're really hoping it rather than believing it. You think you could get that, right, Sean, by doing further study. I don't remember last time I looked at this research whether anyone's done the further study.
I don't know myself.
Yeah. So anyway, so thank you.